So you're probably wondering why in the world I'm reviewing a 3-year-old horror movie, and a couple reasons. I really like what they did with the Halloween reboot, even though this is just a direct sequel to the original film. And there's a new sequel to it coming out in a couple weeks called Halloween Kills that comes out in the middle of October. So that's why I want to talk about it. So let's do it. Thanks so much for checking out the video. Before we get started, click on that red subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you know whenever I post a new piece of content. So John Carpenter, between 1978 and 1983, put out 4 movies, and 3 of them are awesome. He put out The Fog in 1980, I believe, and I've never seen it. I know nothing about it. I know it was kind of a flop at the time. In 19 Starting from the beginning, 1978, he put out Halloween, the slasher masterpiece that really has kind of gone on to define that genre, popularized this silent villain, and is just a great movie that's aged extremely well. In 1982, he put out The Thing, a movie that I have reviewed on this channel and is actually sort of referenced in the first Halloween. The original black and white film, The Thing from Another World, is being watched by one of the kids in Halloween. So I think it's kind of cool that Carpenter has this love for that particular movie, which he then shows in Halloween. And then, 4 years later, he remakes that film based more on the original novella, but puts out The Thing, and it's a commercial flop, and it's a complete failure at the box office, and has gone on to be considered one of the greatest horror films ever made, and really has stood the test of time. So if you want to check out my review, I'll link to it down in the description. And then in 1973, the year after The Thing, he put out his version adaptation of the Stephen King horror novel Christine, which, for a movie about a car that kills people, is actually pretty damn good and has held up extremely well. I've always had this kind of soft spot for the Halloween movies. When I was a kid, I remember watching, my dad was watching, I think it's Halloween 4, The Return of Mike Myers, and this is the one with his niece and his niece Jamie. And I remember as a kid sitting on the floor in my parents' bedroom while my dad was watching this movie. And at the end, there's this fight between like one of the teenage boys and Michael Myers with a shotgun, and they end up like falling off a roof, and then Michael gets killed by the cops. And there's this weird moment where he like transfers his soul into Jamie, his niece. And what's interesting is that there's a scene, the very, very last shot of the movie is young Jamie in like this clown costume holding basically Michael Myers' knife, while Dr. Loomis like screams and is freaking out that Michael has like transferred his soul into his niece. It's weird and strange, but when I was a kid, that scene stuck with me for like decades, and I didn't remember what movie it was from. And then finally, like it clicked, that it was Halloween. And then of course, like decades later, in the early, I think in like the mid 2000s, I finally got around to watch, or maybe late 2010 or late 2000s, I went and watched it and was like, yeah, this I remember this exact scene from when I was a kid. I remember not knowing where it was from, but looking back on it now, it's funny that I've like kind of kept that image in my head, in the back of my head, for so long, of that particular scene. But looking back at the movies, they vary in quality. Obviously, the first one is fantastic. Halloween 2 is not very good. And then the subsequent sequels, they vary in quality. There's H20, which is I think it was like 2000, 2001, kind of reboot slash sequel 20 years after the original. Oh, no, I guess it was 1998 if it's H20, so 98. And that movie was, it was fine. And then Rob Zombie got his claws into a full-on reboot, which made a critical mistake, and that was that it tried to humanize Michael. And one of the big points of the original film is that Michael is very much a blank slate. He's a canvas that you project your own fears onto. We know nothing about him. All we know is that he, murdered his sister when he was a kid, was institutionalized, and that's it. He has no spoken dialogue as a child or as an adult in any of the original films. And so, what the biggest miscalculation that the zombie movies, among several that they made, that Rob Zombie made, was that it tried so hard to humanize a character that didn't need to be humanized. Whereas the original film really played up the fact that we know nothing about this character, and that's what makes it great and makes it scary in particular. Another thing the zombie films really fumble is they made them mean. Those movies are very cynical and mean spirited and nasty just for the sake of being nasty. Now, don't get it wrong here, like slasher films are meant to be scary and, you know, not mean spirited, but they're meant to be nasty and scary and bloody and gory and all that stuff. And that's what's appealing about them. But the zombie reboot just kind of didn't understand the original film in any way, shape, or form, which is why Carpenter distanced himself from it. So when I found out that Blumhouse and John Carpenter were teaming up with David Gordon Green to put this film out and do a direct sequel to the original, which discarded some of the lineage. Laurie Strode is no longer related to Michael Myers at all. She's just one of his original potential victims from the first movie. And I think that combination of elements, Carpenter's involvement, him doing the music, Blumhouse, which knows what they're doing when it comes to these types of films, and then Danny McBride's involvement, David Gordon Green, who's a capable director. He's done a couple of movies I really like. I love Pineapple Express, and to hear that he's signing on to do a horror film was kind of fascinating and interesting. He also did that movie Stronger, based on one of the survivors of the Boston Marathon bombing, which I didn't see, but I heard was really good, with Jake Gyllenhaal. And then he did Your Highness, which is just a dumb, as dumb as it gets from a comedy film. It's not a great movie. It's really stupid, but I laughed a lot at it, even though it was kind of thrashed by critics. So bringing him in to do this type of movie was fascinating for me because despite the quality of some of those movies, he's a capable director. So seeing somebody that's known for one thing trying their hand at another, particularly horror, I think is really cool. And what I love about this movie is that it understands the original in the way in the way many of the sequels, and of course the Zombie 2 films, doesn't understand, and that's that the blank slate that Michael Myers is a huge part of the story, and it's played up to great effect here. You know, they talk about the fact that Michael doesn't speak. They talk about the fact that nobody has ever elicited a single emotion out of him. That's kind of cool. You know, the zombie films dug so far into, like, you know, Michael's childhood trauma and growing up in this screwed up household as a kid and abusive, you know, parentage and all this stuff. And none of that stuff is present here. And that's what makes it work. This is very much a stripped down type of horror film that understands the basics in a way some of these other films do not. And yeah, of all of the slasher movies that I've seen over the course of the last decade or so, I think this is by far the best, you know. And I love these types of movies. I'm a huge fan of the Friday the 13th movies. I'm a huge fan of the Chucky movies. And I like Nightmare on Elm Street's okay, but I'm more lean towards the Friday the 13th films and the Halloween films because I like that non-speaking evil character villain that inhabits these slasher movies. So bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis for the role, clearly they did a lot of work in getting the script into something that would appeal to her, and it works. It's a movie about overcoming your fears and coming to grips with your past and then ultimately confronting it. And I'm excited that there's a sequel coming out. I'm really interested to see what direction they take it, because we're actually getting 2 sequels, both of which were pushed back by a year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Originally, this film was supposed to come out last October, and then the 3rd film in the series, Halloween Ends, was going to come out in, I think, like October 14th or 15th of this year. So we would have been getting the conclusion of this trilogy. Instead, we're getting the 2nd film this year, and it comes out in just a few short weeks. So the performances here are also great. And something else I really appreciate about this movie is that it has just the right sense of humor. It has a couple of scenes where there's just smart, snappy, funny dialogue that doesn't contribute all that much to the story, but gives you just enough levity to make it feel to make it feel um not bleak. It's a far cry from the zombie films. Those had no humor whatsoever. And I think it's a smart move to inject some real levity into what is a decidedly dark movie. If there's one criticism I do have of the film, it's that some of the kills and some of all that stuff is just very like it's very bland. There's nothing really super exciting here when it comes to the way Michael dispatches his victims. Although I think the performance of James Jude Courtney in the lead role of playing Michael is fantastic. We get some glimpses of, the side of his face and the back of his head. We have a general overview of what he looks like, some scarring on the side of his face, but we never get a proper view of what he looks like. And I think this is again another smart decision that doesn't humanize him, but makes you realize that he's flesh and blood. I don't know if that explanation makes sense, but having a character that is indeed human and that is human, and the film wants you to understand that he's a living, breathing, functioning person, but also that he's just this purely evil thing. So the movie does two things really well with this. It shows you his flesh and blood nature through really the first 15, 20 minutes of the film, and then after that he becomes the blank slate evil that we are familiar with. So if you haven't seen the 2018 Halloween sequel, which kind of feels like a reboot, even though it is a proper sequel that retcons the series and discards all of the previous sequels to the original film, this really is fantastic work from David Gordon Green and Danny McBride, who was heavily involved in writing the script and pitching it to Carpenter and to Blumhouse. So if you want to see this movie, if you want to see the sequel, which comes out in a couple weeks, I would definitely check out 2018's Halloween. It does have the same title as the original film, so make sure you watch the right one. And another thing I do want to mention about this movie is that the score is fantastic, and I think that John Carpenter, his score with The Thing is incredible. And the Halloween score is truly an iconic piece of music. It's so freaking simple. It's literally just a guy nailing keys on a keyboard, and that's it. And it's so simple and so basic, and it's really perfect. It's awesome. It's amazing. And part of that really roped me in with this movie and really made me love it is in the beginning they have the sequence where they introduce Michael, and he's in Smith's Grove, this sanatorium where he's going to be transferred to a maximum security prison, and one of the guys who's doing this podcast, they're trying to research Michael Myers, find out what makes him tick, and then ultimately talk to Laurie as well. And they show Michael his mask, and he's just nothing. They get no emotion out of him. He barely even acknowledges their existence. He does this mild little twitch when they pull a mask out, but that's basically it. There's no acknowledgement whatsoever of what's going on. And Aaron, who's one of the podcasters, starts screaming at Michael, say something. They desperately want to get something out of him, and he just nothing. And he screams and he's say something. And then there's this perfectly timed smash cut to the music and the pumpkin and the exact same credit sequence from the original, with the pumpkin, with the jack-o'-lantern that's being crushed. In this case, it's being uncrushed and opening back up in reverse. And all of it is simply awesome. This movie nails the tone. It has just the right amount of blood and guts. The characters, the acting is all fantastic. And it's a really, really special movie that understands the original and pays loving tribute to it at the same time, while crafting something that feels that feels appropriate for today and feels appropriate for taking 40 years after the original, which it does, because the original came out in 1978. This film came out in 2018. So Check it out. Thank you so much for checking out the review. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, please consider subscribing. You can also like and share the video since that tells YouTube it's worth promoting. Sound off down in the comments. Are you excited for Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends? Let me know what you think of this movie. Let me know what you think of the original. And I'll see you next Wednesday at 9 a.m.